Welcome to Spotlight. College sports is more popular than ever. In fact, as we sit here on the cusp of March Madness, just watch what happens to worker productivity next month during the first weekend of the tournament. But also, college sports is perhaps more in jeopardy than it ever has been before. New name, image, and likeness rules have completely upended recruiting, which are, of course, the foundation of all college sports. Our guest is Cody Campbell today, who has become increasingly involved in trying to figure out a workable solution. Cody Campbell is a former football player at his Texas Tech, his alma mater, Texas Tech University, a proud Red Raider, and he played in the NFL with the Indianapolis Colts. He is a distinguished fellow at the America First Policy Institute, and he's a board member here with us at Texas Public Policy Foundation, and he's a member of the Board of Regents of the Texas Tech University system. Cody, welcome to Spotlight.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for having me.
Well, let's get to know you first a little bit. First of all, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about Sunday and what you thought. You're a huge Texas Tech fan. Obviously, Patrick Mahomes didn't have the game that he wanted to. I will say, though, that I'm very proud of our lifetime Longhorn Xavier Worthy. There seemed to be a Texas Tech to Texas connection that maybe we can have some of that magic today on Spotlight.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think we can expect for that to happen. No, it was a disappointing game. I felt bad for Patrick. He just had no protection. He had no time to throw, and I think anybody that follows football knows that the game is won up front. On the O line and D line, and Philadelphia kind of took it to him.
Well, I won't make you lament on that. And our producer here, Jefferson, is also a Kansas City Chiefs fan. So we're going to give him a few more days before we make him figure out what went wrong. But let's take you back then to your days at Texas Tech. Just to give our audience a little understanding. What was it like? I mean, you played from 2000, 2003, beginning of the 2000s. You were recruited in the late 90s. What was it like then to get recruited to play big time football in America?
Well, the recruiting world back then was very different than it is now. The game was the same, but during that day, and really, I was one of the last few kind of recruiting classes that was treated this way. But you really had your recruiting process started and finished after your senior football season was over. Mm-hmm. You would get letters from colleges, and coaches would come visit you at school or maybe at home, like a little bit, during your senior year, during your senior season, but you would play your last high school game, and then you would take your 4 or 5, however many they allowed, recruiting visits to the different places you were interested in, and then you make a decision, and then you would sign your national letter of intent the first week of February, mm-hmm. and that was the process. And nowadays they start recruiting kids when they're, sophomores in high school. Guys will commit when they're that age. And then, they have the early signing period in December now. So a lot of kids are foregoing their last semester in high school to, go ahead and go to the college that they're going to play for. And so, and now the internet closely follows recruiting. There are all kinds of publications and websites that people subscribe to that, evaluate all these recruits and rank them and rank the recruiting classes and all that kind of stuff. None of that existed when I was growing up. And so, it's definitely changed. I got recruited by, a lot of different schools, a lot of the more academic schools because I was a good student. And, but I'd always been a Texas Tech fan because my dad played football at Texas Tech, and I'm actually 4th generation Texas Tech graduate. And so, it was always a place that was sort of special to me. But I really thought that I was going to go play in the Ivy League. And, I probably would have if for the fact they don't give athletic scholarships in the Ivy League. Mm-hmm. And so, and it still costs a lot of money to go to school there. And, I sort of made the calculation that I could get, go to Tech and, get an undergraduate education and get a master's before I was done playing there, or I could go to the Ivy League and it would be free essentially. Or, I could go to the Ivy League and pay for it and get an undergraduate degree from up there. And so I thought academically, maybe I was going to be in the same spot. So, decided that I wanted to play high level football and wanted to play at the place that my dad did, the same position my dad did and all that kind of stuff. And so, that was appealing to me. But I was in Mike Leach's very first recruiting class at Texas Tech in 2000. Oh, wow. That was his first head coaching job. He had previously been the offensive coordinator at Oklahoma. And so, when I went on my recruiting trip there, like he didn't even have all his boxes unpacked in his office. And, like in Mike Leach fashion, he was like wearing a Hawaiian shirt and some like, cargo shorts and flip flops. And it was the last recruiting trip I went on. The others I'd gone to, like the head coach was wearing a suit and, it was very formal and, all that kind of stuff. And Leach kind of just put his feet up on the desk and he said, well, want you to come play football here. Think you're a good player. I want to offer you a scholarship. What do you think? I was like, I love this. He came across as being very authentic, and, very genuine. And of course, nobody knew who he was at that time. He had not coached a game as a head coach. But even then, at 17 or 18 years old, I could sense that he was a really special, personality and somebody that I wanted to play for.
Absolutely. Well, you talk about signing your letter of intent. This gets kind of into the how things have changed over the last couple of decades. What was the culture like when you made a commitment to a school? It was obviously a huge decision.
Yeah, well, see, the thing is, like, the timeline was a lot more condensed.
Mm-hmm.
So, there wasn't as much time to like waffle and change your mind and everything. But in general, once you made a verbal commitment to a school, that's where you were going to go because you gave your word that you're going to do it. And that used to mean something. But then so many kids started backing out on verbal commitments, it became no big deal anymore to go back on what you told people you're going to do. And so now they flip flop all the time. And of course, even after you sign, even after you enroll, you can transfer whenever you want to. So there's really no commitment.
But that's what I'm asking about, like the culture. Did you feel, was there a pressure not to do that? Where today it's like, it's a free for all. We'll get into that later. But like at the time, once you made a commitment, did you feel, committed to that for 4 years? And that was kind of what the culture was at the school.
Yeah, absolutely. I was supposed to, in fact, I committed to Tech that weekend on my recruiting visit. I was supposed to go to Harvard the next weekend. And I think I had one, maybe Stanford the weekend after that. And I canceled both my remaining recruiting visits when I committed. And I was like, I'm done. I told you I'm going to come here. I'm going to come here. There's no reason for me to take other visits. And so, and part of that's just how I was raised,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that maybe the culture is a little different these days, but my parents always, beat it into me that when you give somebody your word, you need to stick to it. So,
yeah, and I wonder if maybe if you had been indoctrinated up there in Harvard, that you may not be on the boards of AFPI and TPPF and other good conservative organizations.
But I in retrospect, it definitely worked out pretty well for me, and Texas Tech was exactly the right place for me to go.
Did you ever feel like there was an instance where you wanted to transfer? Was there ever, or were there other students, or other players that felt, like this wasn't working out for them, and that they wanted the option to transfer if they could?
Yeah, but at that time, transferring was kind of viewed as like quitting, basically, and it wasn't very common for someone to transfer from, like Power 5 to Power 5. Like usually, a couple guys transferred. I remember the guy I came in with transferred and ended up going to Central Arkansas. And that he's the only one I can really remember that transferred during that time period. I mean, you kind of felt like you were stuck, which is actually a good thing because it forces you to learn how to deal with adversity. Right. And difficulty, and allows the coaches to actually coach you hard and push you and make you better. And so now, they can't push they want to push the players hard enough that they make them better and they, get to their sort of peak level of, capability. But at the same time, if they push them too hard, they know they're going to leave. And so they can't push them as hard as they once did. And I think that's a shame. I think it's a shame for the players. They're not getting everything out of it that they could or that we did. Back when I played.
Or it's gotten even to the point where not even just pushing them too hard, but not now paying them enough, going somewhere else. So let's get into that. Obviously you're a huge college football fan. You've been involved in the sport for many decades. When did you start to notice that things were starting to shift and change? Obviously you have the big Supreme Court case that kind of broke open the floodgates in NCAA versus Alston. And we'll talk about that in a second. But like, did you, even before, the court decisions and all of that, did you feel like something was shifting? And about when did you start to see that things were moving in a different direction?
Yeah. So the big changes started in the summer of 2021, and it actually resulted from a state law change in California. And they were the first ones to make it a law that players could profit from their name, image, and likeness. And so, as soon as they did that, in order to remain competitive with the schools in California, a bunch of other states started adopting the same law. And of course, that was challenged by the NCAA. And that began a series of lawsuits lost by the NCAA on grounds of antitrust.
Mm-hmm.
And so, every time the NCAA has lost a lawsuit, which there have been, I think they're about 0 for 18 or 0 for 19 right now.
It's not good.
Most of them have been pretty narrow decisions, so they've continued to have their authority eroded, just, piece after piece, but they're losing every one, and it's all on the same grounds. The Alston case that you refer to, was related to, it brought about these academic achievement awards that they can get now. But the thing that was really damaging in that case was the consenting opinion that was rendered by Judge Kavanaugh, who basically said that, not basically, he directly said that the NCAA was acting in violation of every antitrust law that's ever been written,
Mm-hmm.
and that the NCAA is not above the law. And he signaled that if a more broad case were to come before the court, that they would essentially blow the whole thing up.
Yeah.
And so that is where the NCAA, after that case, they kind of changed their tact. They decided to stop going all the way to the mat on all these cases, and they started settling more of them, which is what they should have started doing in the first place. Actually, going back, even to when I played or before, they should have started taking care of the athletes better, because the money got so big, it just became obviously unfair.
Right.
You got coaches making $12 million or more a year. You got administrators making millions of dollars. The media is making tons of money off this thing. But the players, when I was playing, you got your scholarship, which was great, and I really appreciated it. But outside of the scholarship, you were only allowed to even get a job where you made $2,500 a year, because they're worried about somebody like paying you under the table.
Right.
So it doesn't cover your full cost of attendance. A scholarship did not at the time. So you only have another $2,500 you can make at a job, which I was able to do working for my uncle. And, but how do you cover the rest of your expenses? Well, either your family has to help you. If they can't help you, you have to take out student loans.
Right.
And so, that's, I left college with some student loans, and, I was supposedly on full scholarship. Meanwhile, the school's bringing in tens of millions of dollars a year off of people paying to watch what I was doing. And so,
right. And one of the big criticisms is that the NCAA had a long time that they could have been making, they could have been making changes that, to your point, I mean, the things that were clearly unfair, the things that were, were unfair to the players, they had decades that they could have been making incremental changes, but instead they never really made any changes. And then you have Kavanaugh's decision that's like a hammer, and then all, pardon my French, but all hell breaks loose. How much do you put that on the NCAA for being unwilling to make changes over the 2000s and 2010s?
Oh, I put it squarely on their shoulders. And I think, having had exposure to higher education through, my work on the tech board, I understand why it's happened. It's because the NCAA and the conferences, for that matter, are governed and by a bunch of university presidents. And I love a lot of them, and they're very, very smart people, and love hanging out with them and enjoy talking with them and everything else. But they're not good at making decisions quickly, and they tend to want to form committees, and they tend to kind of want to sit around and think about things and talk about them for a really long time, and they're very, very slow to act. And so that's where the NCAA kind of found itself, is in a position where they just didn't do anything, and over time, the situation just got more and more obviously unfair. And it's blown up on them, and so now they've completely lost relevance. I mean, in the last few months, there was another court case in Tennessee where a player who'd played in junior college prior to going to a 4-year school sued, saying that his junior college, the time he spent in junior college, should not count against his eligibility, and the court ruled that it can't. Like, the NCAA can't hold that against him. So, you can have guys go to junior college for 2 years, and that won't count against their eligibility. They come to a 4-year school, they redshirt, and they have 4 years of eligibility after that. So you could have, a lot of players in school for 7 years on a regular basis. In fact, you could have a player right now say, hey, look, I know my 4 years of eligibility is expired, but I'm going to play a fifth year or a sixth year or a 10th year, sue the NCAA for that, and the court's going to rule in his favor because that's how the law is written, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
We'll
the
call that
schools
the
and
Tyler Shuck rule.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, he's played forever. And that's what's going to happen. That's going to continue to happen. So you're going to continue to have these erosions in the NCAA's authority, or you're going to have one big case that finally comes to the Supreme Court and the whole system just implodes.
Well, let's look at after post Alston, we've had NIL now for about 3 years. Outside of the lack of authority that the NCAA has, or lack of credibility that the NCAA has, set that aside for a second. Just looking at kind of how the system works now, where you have whether it's Texas or Texas A&M or Miami or whoever, you can have these major boosters that come in and say, "Hey, we'll give you 10 million." Say it without saying it, but we'll give you $10 million if you play here.
Yeah.
What is the core problem with the current system that has got you motivated to find a solution?
Well, so the way that it's worked for the last 2.5 years is that the NIL. So originally, the California law made it so that kids can go out and like sign autographs or make an appearance at a local business or whatever and get paid for that. Which it was always assumed that was going to be relatively small dollars, but they should be allowed to do that. That you shouldn't restrict their right to free commerce in that way. But then what it pretty quickly turned into is that these boosters would get together and form these collectives, pool their money, and then pay kids to either stay at that school or pay them to come in as recruits. And early on, there were rules that the NCAA tried to enforce where this NIL money could not be used for recruiting inducement. And so they tried to enforce that for a while. That got blown up by a court case. And, there are a couple more court cases. And so now there are absolutely no restrictions at all on how NIL can be used. So you can use it for recruiting inducement. You can pay players when they're still in high school. You can make them promises to come to your school. The financial promises, if they come to your school, you're going to pay them X. And so right now it's just a complete Wild West. There was a recent case that was, it was filed in 2020, a class action lawsuit in California that is styled House v. NCAA. And it was a group of former players who were suing the NCAA over the fact that they were not allowed to capitalize on their NIL rights when they were players. The NCAA decided to settle that one last year. And so that class action settlement has been working its way through the courts. And starting July the 1st, players are actually going to receive a percentage of the revenue from the athletic department directly.
Current
So
players.
the NIL collectives are going to go away, and every school is going to have a salary cap. It's $20.5 million for this fall that they're going to be paying to the players directly from their revenues. And so it's formulaic, but in terms of average revenue across all the Power 5 schools or Power 4 schools, you get to this $20.5 million. And so every school that chooses to participate will have essentially the same amount of money to spend on their players.
Now, I don't want to skip over the impact of what you just said there, because in settling that case, what they avoided is if they had gotten the wrong judgment in that court case, you're talking about the NCAA would have had to pay back NIL to thousands and thousands of players going back to the 80s.
That's the other part of the settlement is that they are paying back NIL. So there's a $2.5 billion payment of back payments. Anybody that played after 2018 or up until the time when you could capitalize on your NIL, is going to get a share of that $2.5 billion. And then moving forward, the current players are going to get a portion of the revenue share. So that's the settlement. But the problem with that settlement is, and the Biden Department of Justice filed a statement of interest in the Northern Court of California, District Court of California, saying essentially that this settlement's great. You guys can do whatever you want, but this still doesn't resolve the underlying antitrust issue that still exists. And so basically open the door for athletes to continue to sue the schools for acting as a cartel and colluding together to create this salary cap limitation. And so they just don't have any protection. And so that brings us to why, we have to have federal legislation. The direction we're going right now is that the players are going to ultimately become employees of the university instead of student athletes, and they're going to unionize. And the reason why this has to happen absent of legislation, is that the only way that the NCAA, the conferences, the universities can get antitrust protection is through a collective bargaining agreement. So all the pro sports leagues have antitrust protection because they collectively bargain with their players' union. And so if you have a collectively bargained employment agreement, that exempts you from antitrust litigation. And so that's what that's the only choice that college sports has to save itself from essentially being blown up. And so what you're going to see is that a lot more money will go to the two main revenue sports, which this is something that a lot of people don't know, but football and men's basketball are what pay for everything else. Between 90 and 95% of college athletic department revenues come from football and men's basketball. And so that money is used to pay for Olympic sports and women's sports. So, like sports like baseball, like tennis, like swimming, like gymnastics, like wrestling, softball, volleyball, those are all paid for by football and men's basketball. And so if one of two things happen, number one, if the players end up taking too much money, the football and men's basketball players end up taking too much money, there won't be money left over for women's sports and Olympic sports. Or if the stakes just become so high that only a few schools can afford to participate, then you're going to see our college athletic system completely evaporate.
Now you just mentioned it. Your solution to that is a federal proposal or federal legislation. Not for nothing. That's a provocative proposal for a strong conservative to put out there, that there needs to be a federal solution. Why do you say that it has to be done at the congressional level?
Well, we've tried it at the state level. We've tried it through the courts. Everything possible has been done short of allowing the players to unionize and do collective bargaining, which I think would be much worse than having the federal government involved. The only choice that we have legally, the only route that we have is federal legislation. That's it. And, I'm, very principled and, believe that the federal government should only be involved as a last resort. But that's where we are,
right.
Is if we want to preserve this system that, there are over 500,000 student athletes in this country. College athletes earned 329 medals in the Paris Olympic Games. American women dominate sports internationally. And that's all because we have this incredible college sports system that we've had for the last 120 years that works really, really well.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a system that is unparalleled anywhere else in the world. No other country has a college sports system. Everywhere else, they have a state-sponsored and state-funded Olympic development system. And most other countries don't really have a women's sports system.
Mm-hmm.
We have both, and we do it better than anybody because of the system that we have developed, accidentally, essentially. And so, but it's a huge asset to our country. I mean, you talk about these 500,000 student athletes, only a small percentage, 1% or so, maybe even less, end up going pro in their sport. The rest of them go out into the workforce. And those individuals have developed toughness, competitive spirit, work ethic, and character that creates leadership and, creates more capability in our workforce. And so it's a great development tool that the United States has that gives us a competitive advantage that I don't think most of us appreciate.
Let me jump in real quick. One of the other big issues that that is important to you, and Cody has authored a great piece at thefederalist.com on this, and so I invite our listeners to go and check out that piece at The Federalist. One of the other major issues that you talk about is that whatever the solution is, it has to be maximally inclusive of the 134 football, getting back to football, the 134 football bowl subdivision schools. So all 134 schools, there have been some proposals to create some kind of premier league for just 30 or 40 schools, or to have multiple subdivisions where you have schools like Texas Tech may not necessarily make it into the top level, and that's something that's obviously a concern to a lot of people for schools that if you're not Alabama or you're not USC, and so one of your real focuses and priorities is how do we do this for all 134 schools to make it fair for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. We can't allow this creeping monopoly to occur. If you allow a small group of schools to monopolize the high revenue sports, then you're killing the rest of the college sports system throughout the rest of the country.
Mhm.
And again, 134 FBS schools is a lot of schools. That's a lot of communities that are affected, and it's a lot of young people that are no longer going to be given the opportunities that they're given through sports. And it's the opportunity for education, it's the opportunity for social mobility, it's the opportunity for character development that benefits the whole country, but especially benefits those individuals. And so we cannot allow that to happen. So part of this legislation needs to be making sure that it is inclusive of as many schools as possible, and that we find a way to make sure that the revenue model is fair. What the NFL figured out a long time ago is that it it benefits all of them if each of them are able to build their brand. If the Buffalo Bills have a better following and more people are interested in watching their games, that's good for the Dallas Cowboys. And so that's kind of what we have to realize in college sports and college football in particular, is that we can't let this thing shrink down to such a small league that either people just stop participating in it, or that you don't have that branding opportunity for the less fortunate schools. And so I think that definitely needs to be a part of it. It needs to be something that's considered. This is bigger than just the transfer portal. It's bigger than just NIL. It's making sure that we preserve the Olympic sports system that we have across the whole country, and we preserve women's sports. And President Trump had a great victory in the executive order he signed last week that he worked with Riley Gaines on, to keep men out of women's sports. And we talk a lot about saving women's sports and preserving women's sports. Well, I don't think most people recognize that the whole women's sports system is a house built on shifting sand. If the money isn't there for those sports, they're not going to exist.
Right.
And so we have to ensure that the tradition and the model, again, that we sort of developed accidentally, but is so beneficial to our country, persists, and that it isn't taken away by people who are being selfish or people who are trying to monopolize football and men's basketball.
And while we still have a couple minutes left, I wanted you to address. You talked about the EO from last week. I'm very cynical in terms of what I think Congress can get passed and what it can't get passed, or how soon, how quickly it can move on things. Obviously, the president is not shy about issuing executive orders or trying to get policies enacted and implemented from the White House, from the bully pulpit. So if congressional legislation isn't going to happen quick enough, particularly to your liking, and we're putting sports at this very important issue in jeopardy, what can the White House do in your mind? How quickly can they act, and what kind of policies can they start to implement quickly to try and rectify some of these issues?
I do think that the White House could issue an executive order that would sort of act as a tourniquet to stop the bleeding, and give some time to getting good legislation developed. I'm concerned that the window of opportunity is narrow to get legislation passed. I do think that there's bipartisan support, on some level, where if you come up with the right solution, you could get something passed. And there are going to be some difficult issues to contend with, but I do think that, and I know for a fact because I've sat down with them. But if you sit down with people on both sides of the aisle, they ultimately want the same thing. They understand the opportunity this system provides to so many kids who wouldn't have it otherwise. Many of whom are first generation college students, many of whom are minorities, many come from low income families. Everyone understands the system provides huge benefit, and they want to save it. And so I think if everyone's intentions prevail, their good intentions prevail, I think that we can actually get it done. But in the near term, the White House could do something to sort of slow the erosion and the destruction of the system, so that maybe it'll be a little bit easier to put the pieces back together legislatively.
Well, that's great to hear. Cody Campbell, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your views and your thoughts on this really, really important issue. I'm a huge, huge college football fan, so this is very important to me, as I'm sure a lot of our listeners and watchers. So thank you so much for being on with us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Take care.
And for you, thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.